Really pioneers for all of us. You know, they have gone before us, they have cut the trail, they've gone up some hard rocky roads, they've fought some battles, and because of their work, because of their amazing personal sacrifices, you know, we're all here today in this room. And I know it's a great reward for all of you to, you know, go around the country and to see the changes, especially you, Colin and Dean, that have started out so many years ago and have seen the change and the things that have transpired over the last, you know, 5 years, really. It's been such a huge movement. So what I thought we would do
in no small
today
part to you as well. So,
thank you. I appreciate that, Dean. Thank you. You know, I just want to make this very conversational. So between the four of us and then also you all. So I have a few questions I would like to ask them, and then I'm going to open it up questions from you all as well that we can, you know, maybe delve a little deeper than the research that we've heard and learn some more of the backstory, and also to hear about their vision for the future, because I think that's really important, because they obviously saw into the future almost prophetically and have worked to get there, but I know that they see further than we do right now. So I have a couple of questions for you guys that I thought would be interesting. You know, one question that I thought I would like to talk about is, you know, other than your own research, what would you say are like the top 2 or 3 pieces of research that are like fundamental cornerstones for plant-based nutrition? So that's why I said other than your own, because I want Dean and I to come up with a couple of others to point to. But if you had to think through the trials that have been completed to date, the meta-analyses, you know, what are the top couple of pieces of research that you would point to that say this really helps to define plant-based nutrition? And then on the tail end of that is, what are the couple of studies that we still need to do? And what are the pieces of research that still need to be done to clarify this vision? Dean?
You want me to start? Well, I've never been asked that question before, and I've been asked a lot of questions, so that's good. Colin's work with the China study was very important. Not only in terms of showing from an epidemiological standpoint that the diseases we take for granted in this country are really not natural at all, and that even though they have the same genetic diversity as we do, or at least close to it, those genes don't get expressed until they get into a Western diet and lifestyle. But you're all familiar with his work, but the other part of your work that I find has been really inspiring was you were one of the first, you know, you and K.K. Carroll and some others were one of the first to talk about getting beyond this whole fat versus carbs debate into animal protein itself being atherogenic and creating inflammation and oxidative stress and other things that lead to so many chronic diseases. So from both aspects of your work, I salute that. I think what Walter Willett's done with physicians and Harvard nurses' health studies, I think, have been helpful in showing the strong link between a meat-based diet in particular increasing the risk of so many chronic diseases. And even though it's not an interventional study, it's an epidemiological one. The fact that it can collect such large amounts of data, and from the Harvard prestige of being able to disseminate that information, I think it's really had a great impact. And I think what you've been doing with nutritionfacts.org has been, I think, the best public service that is really out there in the plant-based world. Really done for all the right reasons, with great intelligence and making it fun and interesting and impactful and with great integrity, all of which are in rare supply these days. And Scott, the work that you've done with the Plantrition Conference, getting 1,500 or 2,000 people at a time from, you know, multiple countries, has been raising awareness. And to me, awareness is always the first step in healing. So I want to acknowledge you for that too.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate that. Thank you. Colin?
Can I, first off, I want to acknowledge my friends, of course, for what you guys have done. Mr. Encyclopedia over there. And Dean, we got onto each other's work. When was it? 30 years ago?
19th century, I think. 19th century. Yeah. I look good for 96, don't you think?
I'd like to change the question just a little bit, if you don't mind. And that is, I'd like to honor some people who got forgotten in this field. And some of the research that was done so long ago and forgotten. It says something about, you know, who we are, why do we do what we do, and something wrong with the science maybe to some extent. But I have to think of a guy named Chittenden, back in the early 1900s. He did the best study on diet and physical conditioning, athleticism. I mean, it was classic. He had 2 books about that thick each.
What was
One
his name again, Colin?
Chittenden, Russell Chittenden.
Chittenden.
He was
Yeah.
head of physiology at Yale University, and he did this very thoughtful kind of study, and I won't go into the details here, but the results that he got were so striking, and it came at a time when questioning the supposed superiority of animal protein, for example, or questioning protein in general, when he raised that question at the time, he really took kind of a hit, and they almost dismissed him, and nobody heard of him hardly ever since.
You wouldn't know anything about what that's like, would you?
I wasn't living quite then. Is that what you're saying?
No. I mean, in terms of, people criticizing new ideas.
Oh, yeah. I guess, well, maybe that's why I'm sort of talking the way I am, because I have some sympathy, some empathy for those guys. But there was another study that done too at that time, 2 or 3 studies that eventuated in a publication in 1923 to show that cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, is not the cause of elevated levels of cholesterol in the blood, which in turn was alleged to be related to heart disease, and so the story went. The story became rather simplistic over the years. And what was shown at that time, rather conclusively amongst some 10 to 12 research groups, that the cause of high cholesterol was not really the fat or the cholesterol itself, it was the animal protein. Now, then under the standards of today, that wasn't as convincing perhaps as it could be today, but looking at a larger context, that was really significant. It wasn't that was so proof positive of that relationship. It just got forgotten, ignored. It was my friend, Dr. Krzyzewski, who turned that up some years ago. But I think this story has been brewing, for a long time. And, we've been a benefactor to some extent, some of that early work got forgotten, and we come back and...
Thank you, Michael.
To continue the love fest, so nutritionfacts.org would not exist if not for a publication on July 21st, 1990, in perhaps the most prestigious medical journal in the world, Dr. Dean Ornish and colleagues, the Lifestyle Heart Trial, randomized controlled trial, first showing that you can reverse the #1 killer of men and women. Since that day, no more studies. I mean, you could stop research right there and save hundreds of thousands of people's lives every year. Like, we really cared about saving lives? If doctors really cared about saving lives, okay, no more, not a penny more research needed to save literally hundreds of thousands of Americans alone every single year continue to die from this preventable, arrestable, reversible condition. So that is what started me on my journey, and to unearth all the other mountains of evidence that's been just kind of buried, and to bring that out to light. So we all have a tremendous debt to owe to
Thank
Dean.
you. Fully received.
And so the follow-up to that question then is, what do we still need to know? Like, what pieces of research still need to be done? There's so much research that's being churned out in plant-based nutrition now, which is really exciting, but there's probably a couple of key studies that would really tip the scales.
Well, I'm most interested in the study we're actually doing, which is to see whether we can reverse Alzheimer's disease by the same kind of lifestyle changes. And as I talked about in more length earlier today, I think we're at a place with Alzheimer's very similar to where we were with heart disease 40 years ago. There was every reason to think it may be reversible. It's the same biological mechanisms that affect all of these chronic diseases, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in the microbiome and telomeres, angiogenesis, gene expression, overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, et cetera. There are no good drugs for treating it or for preventing it. It's, I think, the worst disease because when you lose your memories, you lose everything. And I have a personal interest because my mom and many of her siblings died of it, so I'm sure I have the ApoE4 gene as well. But I think it's going to work, and in some ways it may be even more, if it does work, and I'm only speculating, but if it does work, it'll be even more impactful than the heart disease studies because at least they had other treatments for heart disease. There are no good treatments for Alzheimer's, and as our population ages, it's going to become an increasingly both expensive and horrible proposition. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hope that we'll have some good news to share in a year or two.
And just to follow up on that, thinking about Alzheimer's, how do you perceive the physiology? I asked Dr. Dean Sherzai recently, what's the genesis event that initiates Alzheimer's?
Well, he and his wife are doing some great work, and they wrote a great book about preventing Alzheimer's. Again, I think the studies like the finger study from Finland and others have shown that less intensive interventions can slow the rate of progression, much as they did 40 years ago with less intensive lifestyle interventions could slow the rate of progression of heart disease. That's part of why I think that a more intensive intervention may even reverse it. And again, because it's affecting all these mechanisms that cause it. Every one of these mechanisms, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, change in the microbiome, et cetera. I mean, your microbiome, for example, produces amyloid. It produces many of the neurotoxins that end up in your brain. Beyond the diet is the other aspects, that in people with Alzheimer's, it's not like your brain in the early stages gets destroyed. Those memories are still there. You just lose the connections to them. And I think the social isolation and the depression and the being cut off, and then when you have Alzheimer's, you often get into a kind of a downward spiral where you start to forget things, and then you get embarrassed. You don't want to go out much because you don't want to embarrass yourself, and then that makes you more isolated, which makes you more forgetful, and then maybe you lose your driver's license, and now your world contracts even more, or you end up in an assisted living center where you don't see your friends or family nearly as much. And I think that in some ways it may be an adaptive response to this kind of chronic loneliness and isolation that I think is really what's epidemic in our culture. And so I think that it's important to focus on diet, but I think these other aspects, eat well is great, but also the move more, stress less, and love more, particularly the love more, is one that I think I'd like to see more research on.
In regards to the question of the future, I'm really fascinated with the idea that, individual nutrients that we've studied for so long and tried to really focus in on their activities and what specifically they do. We've been thinking in such a reductionist way. We practice medicine that way too. And that's caused a lot of confusion because in reality, as far as I'm concerned, nutrition in particular, representation of all the food that we consume and or don't consume, that concept of all of this stuff working together under some kind of guidance that we can't really identify in really miraculous ways. And like you had referred before to the number of so-called mechanisms participating in various and some of the outcomes. I mean, I find this concept of holism really just very exciting. And so we can get away from, arguing, I should say at times, and focus it too much on individual little entities of doing things. And so I think that in the due course of time, I think that idea is going to expand. I've run into quite a number of people that now seem to identify with that. Good. And then in turn asking, well, what is directing traffic, in our bodies? And we can think of all kinds of
even in the
possibilities.
China study, I was wondering whether the social factors may also have played a role. They had much tighter communities as well as healthier diets, and that when they became more westernized, not only did the diet get disrupted, but a lot of those social networks did as well. Did you think that might have played a factor? As they began to more, eat like us and live like us and die like us, in part, though, at the same time their food was changing, their social networks were changing too. Their strong ties in China, the family ties and communities and so on, were getting more disrupted. Do you think that might have played a role as part of that?
That's kind of interesting what you said. I just, in fact, was doing an interview with one of the Chinese people here, and having been in and around China for so long, and they're having educated me so much, particularly in the question of the old Chinese philosophy. I mean, here was a country in transition, especially since the time we did that work. And they're now becoming more urbanized, taking on Western medicine, and so forth and so on. As I look at that scenery, it's clear, at least for me, there were some elements in the Chinese thinking that I really liked. Is that more holistic kind of concept that's so traditional of indigenous populations. And then backing off, and then, okay, now I'll have a look at what we do. We do some things pretty interesting too, especially in the technical sense. And so looking at that, look at this, and then in turn, realizing if we take the best of that, I think we got something really special. And so I, for myself, I'd like to give credit to the opportunity to my Chinese colleagues who sort of taught me some of that.
Good, that's interesting.
Michael?
Not another penny need be spent. So we know the healthiest diet. Now, as a bonus, can it also reverse Alzheimer's? Let's find out. But we don't need that data point to, there's enough evidence to get people eating this healthy. So really, I see much of the research, upcoming research these days is like, what can excite people the most? And it's the reversal. We know people that eat healthier have lower rates of low back pain, for example, a significant cause of disability in this country. But can we reverse low back pain? If we open up those vertebral arteries, get more blood flow to the discs, can we actually reverse low back pain? That'd be a fantastic study. Neil Barnard and PCRM doing some wonderful diabetes reversal studies. Those are the things that really, I think, capture people's imagination. So yes, we know people eating plant-based have between 2 to 3 times lower likelihood of becoming demented later in life. Can actually reverse, that'll get some headlines. So it's really, it's almost like a PR thing. Like, what else can we do to use to treat and reverse? But we already know the key tenets of a healthy diet. In fact, we have for decades remarkable consensus in the medical literature. And so much of this manufactured controversy and daily headlines, if you look to the key tenets of healthy living, we've known about it, they've been around and will continue to be around. And so let's all start eating healthy and then see all the new exciting research coming down the pike.
Can I throw in an idea here? You guys, I do as well, and especially with the work that you started, Dean, on the question concerning reversal. We're still using that word reversal so much. I'd like to suggest just change that and call it treatment. Because if you start, I know this is a sensitive topic, but nonetheless, if you can start thinking about what nutrition can do now, when people have illnesses, that's essentially treatment, and we're treading on some sensitive
Well, it's
territory.
a treatment, but just because you treat something doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get better. And so I like the term reversal because I think it does capture people's imagination that you can actually, instead of getting worse more slowly, which is another form of treatment, you can actually get better and better to the degree that you make these changes. And then for those of you who heard my earlier talk today, forgive me for repeating this, but in my new book, Undo It, I present this unifying theory that the reason, as Mike was saying, that these same diet and lifestyle changes can not only help prevent but even reverse the progression of so many chronic diseases, that they're really, to me, the same disease masquerading and manifesting in different forms because they all share the same underlying biological mechanisms. It's one reason why you often find in the same person, they may have what they call comorbidities. They might have high blood pressure and high cholesterol and diabetes and be overweight and have heart disease, and have strokes or whatever, because they're all the same condition. Or why in Colin Campbell's, revolutionary China study, whole countries had very low rates of these chronic diseases, but until they start to eat like us, even though they have the same genetic differences. For example, it doesn't matter if you're genetically not as efficient at metabolizing dietary fat or animal protein or sugar than someone else if you're not eating that much of it in the first place. But then when you start to, have a Western diet, then those genetic differences begin to manifest. And so I agree with you that these same issues don't necessarily need to be researched in the sense that because it's the same, and it's not like there's one diet for this and another one for that. But I think the more evidence we have, the more we can actually show that it's reversing disease. Take Alzheimer's. We already know that lifestyle changes can slow the rate of progression. That's important since there are no good drugs that will even do that. But if we can actually show that people get better, the light comes back on in their eyes, they begin to remember things they couldn't remember. I'm not saying we're going to show that. I'm not saying we are showing that. I'm saying if we could show that, which I'm hopeful that we could, that's my bias anyway, that would be a revolution, or that would be the kind of thing that can capture people's imagination, almost as a Trojan horse, so that, by the way, the environment, global warming benefits, by the way, you freed up more resources to feed the hungry. There's so many other good things that is more compassionate from an ethical standpoint. Look at prostate cancer. We did a randomized trial showing we could reverse the progression of early stage prostate cancer. We now know that after 10 years, 2 studies in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that men with early stage prostate cancer, after 10 years of being treated with surgery or radiation, didn't live any longer than those that weren't. And maybe 1 out of 50 men do. And Peter Carroll has actually found ways, who's the chief of of urology at UCSF has found ways of identifying who is that 1 out of 50 men who actually benefits from surgery radiation. But the other 49 want to, quote, do something, and if the only thing you have to do is surgery radiation as opposed to watchful waiting and waiting for something bad to happen, most of you guys want to, like, get it out of me, cut it out. And yet those treatments often leave most guys maimed in the most personal ways, being either impotent or incontinent or both. Can't have sex, you're wearing a diaper for no benefit, 49 out of 50 times, at huge economic and huge personal costs. But we were able to show in a study we did here at Sloan Kettering and in UCSF that these same lifestyle changes could slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of early stage prostate cancer. So if the choice is between doing nothing and doing something, most guys are going to want to do something, even if the something is worse than doing nothing. But if you can offer a third alternative, which is intensive lifestyle changes, because we've shown now that you can often reverse its progression, that really captures people's imaginations and enables them paradoxically to make bigger changes than they might otherwise, because again, part of the value of science is to provide new hope and new choices by showing that if you're willing to make these changes, there's a good chance you may get better.
Thank you very much. One of the challenges that we've seen, and one of the criticisms of plant-based nutrition, and your studies have actually answered this criticism, is the idea of adherence and recidivism. And one of the criticisms of plant-based nutrition is that there's very high recidivism levels. People can't maintain this lifestyle. And so I'd just like to ask you for your response to that criticism, because it's very important, and it's important for physicians and healthcare providers to be able to confidently recommend that, knowing that there's going to be long-term adherence.
I think that's a terrific question. I hear of that too. One maybe simplistic sort of notion is that when people are consuming the typical Western diet, there are lots of food addictions. They're addicted to fat. They're addicted to this and that sugar. And those addictions only decline and disappear after time. And so I think some of the recidivism that you're talking about, I think it happens fairly early on. People haven't really rid themselves of that kind of addiction. And because if they, and I don't know what that is, maybe a month, 2, 3, 6 months, whatever. I think the key is just staying with it, having the willpower to stay with it, getting past those addictions when you actually discover these new tastes are pretty good. And so I think, and a lot of the people who do come back, I don't think they're doing it long enough. People do stay with it when they get with it, and they really, mentally, socially, they take on the responsibility, and then they also discover that food is pretty good. I don't know, I think that's a pretty significant thing that may.
Yeah. Do you want me to take a crack at that too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I talked about this earlier at length, but the short version is a lot of this becomes self-fulfilling. If a doctor says, look, I know you're not going to change your diet, and why would you want to anyway? Just take this Lipitor, that'll take care of it. Then the patient doesn't change, and the doctor says, see, I knew they couldn't do it. It all becomes self-fulfilling. But it turns out that half to 2/3 of people prescribed cholesterol-lowering drugs are not taking them just 4 to 6 months later, even though it's just taking a pill. And yet we're finding, Medicare is covering our reversing heart disease program, and most insurance companies are around the country. And it's a 9-week program. 94% of those 72 hours get completed in every site, including in Jackson, Mississippi, Salinas, Arkansas, as well as in Los Angeles or San Diego or places like that. But it's only a 9-week program, and yet a year later, 85 to 90% of the people are still following it at every site we've trained. And a lot of doctors say, how can that be? I can't even get my patients to eat less red meat. You expect me to be vegetarian or vegan? Are you kidding me? And meditate and exercise and love more all at the same time? There's no way. But the paradox is that I've learned through making a lot of mistakes over the many years what does and what doesn't motivate people to change. And what doesn't work is fear. Fear actually works really well for the first month or so after someone's had a scare. If they've ended up in the emergency room or had a heart attack, they'll do pretty much anything the doctor or nurse tells them for about a month or two. And then they stop because it's too scary to think that you're going to die or get a heart attack, so people stop thinking about it. I mean, the mortality rate in this room is still 1 per person. It's 100%, but we don't think about it most of the time. It's too scary. And so I've just found that efforts to try to motivate people that fear is not a sustainable motivator, but what is sustainable is joy and pleasure and love and feeling good. And because these biological mechanisms are so dynamic that affect our health and our well-being, when you make really big changes, it's actually easier to sustain than making small ones because you feel so much better so quickly. It reframes the reason for changing from fear of dying to joy of living. as I talked about earlier, your brain gets more blood, you think more clearly, you have more energy, you can grow so many new brain neurons, your brain can get bigger in just a few months, your heart gets more blood flow, your face gets more blood flow, you look 20 years younger, your sexual organs get more blood flow, your sexual function improves, everything works better. And so what you gain is so much more than what you give up, then it becomes sustainable. And also the other paradox is that it's easier to change your diet along with all these other things, not just eat well, but move more, stress less, and love more, because each of those makes you feel so much better. And then you say, oh, when I do this, I feel good. When I do that, I don't feel so good. So let me do more of this and less of that. And it comes out of your own experience, not because some book or doctor told you. That might have gotten you interested. But then you don't have to get into all these food fights and diet wars and so on. You say, oh, I know this works. I can experience it. And it's not about living longer. It's about feeling better. If you tell somebody you're going to live to be 86 instead of 85, that doesn't really motivate most people. They say, oh, am I going to live longer? Is it just going to seem longer? All those kind of jokes you hear. But when you actually feel, it's just backwards. You actually feel so much better so quickly when you make these changes, to the degree you make them at any age, then that's really much makes. And then if you have the love and support behind you, then people will do things like say, well, why do you want to live longer? I want to dance at my child's wedding. I want to watch them grow up. I want to whatever it is. And then they start to look at their food and say, okay, if I eat this, I'm more likely to be aligned with my life's and my soul's purpose. Then suddenly the food doesn't have those addictions that you so wisely talked about have less of a hold on us because they can be overridden by something that's even more compelling.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Michael, anything to add?
Can't top that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Dean. That is right. That's right. Kind of a follow-up to that, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We're in the early stages of a movement. There's like an inflection that's occurred in the last 5 years that we all can see and feel.
Isn't that when you first started doing your conferences?
Well, so, but the question is, in this movement, what are important elements that we need to focus on to make sure that the movement actually grows, has longevity, and has depth of influence, that we have penetration and we begin shifting culture?
This sounds like off the subject, but it's not really. Reverse Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court. I refer to that because that was the element that allowed, obviously very powerful forces, corporate bodies to support elections and get people elected that they want to get elected. And I've spent quite a bit of time in policy development. I've seen it firsthand, and I'm sure many of you know this as well, that the politicians we elect are those who are we paid the most money for the most part, and they're representing powerful interests. And they're not going to change. And I get quite upset because I have seen in the formation of dietary guidelines and that sort of thing over the years that the pushback that comes oftentimes is actually kind of proactive on the part of the government. I mean, it really does happen that way. We can't really say what we want to say, what we believe to be true sometimes because of that really pretty severe pushback, which in turn is actually coming from very powerful political figures who in turn are representing either elected themselves or working for elected officials that these days are there because of Citizens United. And I can hardly think of another thing that's more pertinent to this argument than actually working together, all of us, to get Citizens United reversed.
Thank you, Dean.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Citizens United was the Supreme Court ruling that said the corporations were people. And so I think you're right on target. There are a lot of powerful forces that converge around the area of food. I was working years ago with Ellen Haas, when she was Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, just to change the school lunch program. And it was increasingly hard. I took a lot of flack for this, but I worked with the CEO of McDonald's to get them to put salads on the menu. I figured, they have 43 million customers a day, and if they could come there and eat salads instead of a burger, that's, incremental change on that scale is worth doing. And they did that, but then the salad was $5.95, the burger's 99 cents, because the burger's subsidized for the reasons you're talking about. The salad wasn't. So you get more calories for your dollar by eating junk food because A, it's subsidized, and B, it doesn't really price into it the real cost to society. So until we change the Farm Bill and change Citizens United and change a lot of these issues that really do dictate policy, it's an uphill battle. But the other thing I would say that can really make a difference in lifestyle medicine is changing reimbursement. In the early 90s, I started a 501c3 nonprofit called the Preventive Medicine Research Institute back in 1984 when I finished my medical training in Boston and moved to San Francisco. In the early 90s, we trained hospitals and clinics around the country. We trained 53 of them for free, basically. Harvard, at Beth Israel, New York, here at Scripps at UCSF, but also in Omaha, Des Moines, Columbia, South Carolina, where they told me gravy's a beverage, this will be a big change in our lifestyle, Broward General, all over the country. And it worked. We got bigger changes in lifestyle, better clinical outcomes, bigger cost savings, better adherence, and a number of the sites closed down because they said you don't have reimbursement. And that was the painful lesson. I thought, well, if we just do good science, do good clinical, they said this is the best program we've had of its kind, and we're closing it down. It's like, it's all about the Benjamins, as the rappers would say, the money. And so I realized that we could do 1,000 studies with 1 million people and would always remain on the fringe of medical practice. And yet if you look at cardiology, since we were doing studies on reversing heart disease, the same interventional cardiologists who were so critical of bypass surgeons who did bypass surgery for years without any studies until they finally got around to doing randomized trials, they realized they don't really work for most people. There are now 8 randomized trials that have shown that stents and angioplasties don't prolong life, don't prevent heart attacks. And then in a study that I don't know how they got through the Human Studies Committee, they did fake angioplasties in London where they put a tube all the way up into the heart and just pulled it out without putting the stent in half the patients. And their reduction in angina was the same as those who actually got the stent, meaning that they don't reduce angina either. And so for decades we've been paying for over almost $100 billion a year for interventions that are dangerous, invasive, expensive, and ineffective. And I remember when I was talking with the then head of Medicare at the time, that this was in the early 2000s, he said, well, look, we might cover this, but you have to get a letter from the head of the National Institutes of Health, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, saying that it's safe for older people to walk, meditate, eat vegetables, and quit smoking. I said, you must be kidding me. And he wasn't. And that's what we had to do. We actually did a whole literature review saying that these were not high-risk behaviors. They sent it back to the head of Medicare, said the diet's safe, don't worry. And actually, they didn't say that. They said in the way that federal government, they said, there's nothing to show that this diet is unsafe for older people. I said, okay, that's good enough. But then so they sent another letter back. Well, you said that the diet is not unsafe, but what about meditating and quitting smoking and walking? Are those okay for older people? So they had to do a second literature review. Now, this is while they're paying $100 billion a year for stents and angioplasties that don't work, that are dangerous, invasive, expensive, and ineffective. So never underestimate, it's follow the money. And I don't want to sound cynical because I'm not a cynical person, but my eyes were open after. It was really heartbreaking in many ways when we had to close down a lot of these sites. So that's when I spent 16 years to work with the people at Medicare to get Medicare coverage, because I knew that if we didn't do that, no matter how many studies we did, it was always be on the fringes. But if you change reimbursement, then you change medical practice and even medical education. And that's what's happening now. And now that Medicare is paying for it, most other insurance companies are. We're showing that they're cutting their costs in half in the first year. And so when we can show that it saves more money than it's costing, and that doctors can make a living doing it, then it goes all the way back to affecting medical practice. It's not just because doctors are only interested in money. Most doctors go into medicine because they really want to help people. But if you're paid to use drugs in surgery and you're trained to use drugs in surgery, then surprise, we use drugs in surgery. And so now that there's a way to make a living doing lifestyle medicine, it's really transformational.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I think there's an irony here in that, yes, the medical device companies and big pharma and meat, dairy, processed food industry, a low trillion-dollar industry, probably the most profitable industry on the planet. But the same kind of corporate forces that allow them to twist the science and have influence within the Beltway can also, maybe in many ways, the savior in terms of this movement. GM spends more money on health insurance than they do on the metal for their on steel, and so there are these corporate players who self-insure. So every one of their employees that gets diabetes, it's a hit to the bottom line, and so it's in their best interest. So to have healthy employees. Insurance companies, it's in their best interest to keep people healthy. There are actually forces in which there is this rare alignment with what's actually good for people is actually saving people money. It's those low-hanging fruit opportunities, I think, that will allow us to influence the larger society. And when you hear that Tyson Foods, for example, right, the largest one of the largest meat companies in the world is starting their an entire new branch of kind of plant-based meats. They're doing that. I mean, Tyson is not about, the CEO of Coca-Cola is not sitting around saying, how can we make children obese? They're thinking, how can we make our stockholders money? And so you do it with dirt cheap ingredients. They're subsidized by taxpayers. You sell for a few bucks a bottle. That's how you make money. The system is just set up to reward bad behavior. But if all of a sudden, Tyson doesn't care. They just want to make money. So if they can make money selling plant-based meats, they can make money selling plant-based meats. I think once we see those kind of indicators, where these large corporate, when Dean Foods, one of the largest dairy companies, bought out Silk soy milk early on.
No relation.
Right? What? Yeah, no relation. I mean, it really pushed the market, and all of a sudden, you have these plant-based milks right in the refrigerated section, and you see this huge drop in liquid milk consumption. Once there's kind of money to be made in health and healthier products, I think that's behind some of the shift we're seeing. So ironically, these evil corporate players may, in many ways, be our salvation in terms of supporting the plant-based movement.
Wow, thank you, Michael. I'm going to jump down and we'll take some questions from the audience. Are there some questions? All right.
It's like Donahue, run acting. All right.
We know that in addition to diet, a critical lifestyle factor for health and wellness is sleep. And my question is about the relationship between diet and sleep. And I'm wondering if there's any evidence that eating better, and particularly a plant-based diet, improves the quality of sleep, the recovery during sleep, or if they're related at all. And two, are there any particular foods or ingredients or things that help one sleep better?
There are some particular foods. So in terms of eating patterns, there are certainly, so for example, Neil Byer and I did some studies where randomized people to plant-based diets for migraines, for menstrual pain, and a number of other clinical conditions. And even though it wasn't the primary outcome, saw an improvement in sleep and energy levels and a bunch of other things as a secondary outcome that was positively affected by the switch to the plant-based diet. And what's nice is we have this randomized controlled study, so you can see that they didn't just get better because because of that dietary change, that changing the diet in general wasn't sleep. It was particularly the plant-based diet that did it. But in terms of specific foods, if you type in sleep in nutritionfacts.org, there are particular foods. So, for example, there was a study that showed that if you eat, how many kiwis? Was it 2 kiwis, a few hours, a certain number of hours before going to sleep, you slept better than eating the same number of bananas, for example. So does that mean kiwis have something special? All we know is kiwis are better than bananas. But maybe and part of that was thinking, well, there's actually melatonin in certain fruits, and maybe that was playing a role. There's a couple other specific foods that on nutritionfacts.org. I think the most important thing are some of the kind of sleep hygiene things beyond just what you eat, but you want it dark and cool and quiet, and there's a number of things you can do to ensure kind of a sleep environment that maximizes, reducing screen time, those blue rays in your eyes right before going to bed. A number of things you can do to improve sleep, which is critically important for health and longevity. I encourage people to get 7 to 8 hours a night.
If anybody has any trouble sleeping, just listen to one of my lectures. It works.
My mother had 2 craniopharyngiomas that she's had operated, so doesn't have the pituitary gland, so she's on about 10 medications, including for diabetes insipidus. She also has dormant pulmonary sarcoidosis, and the most recent to the list is cirrhosis of the liver. And she doesn't have a terrible diet, but it is still, a classic Western American diet. And she can't really go off of her medications completely because of what she has, but how can convincing her that going fully whole food plant-based may help? And I haven't seen any research, or I've tried looking at the research in nutritionfacts.org related to what to do or what to eat that helps with cirrhosis of the liver when you have it. I've seen things about prevention, but what do you do when all of these things together already exist, and how does the diet help?
Even if there is a particular condition for which no studies have been done in terms of dietary interventions of any type, plant-based or otherwise, eating healthy can only help, right? So in terms of, even if it's just not adding extra diseases to the list. So, but in terms of cirrhosis is usually a state of end-stage liver disease where your liver's just so scarred up, and at a certain point, a liver transplant is really one's only option. Specific conditions that a dietary intervention can help with, please feel free to contact me. And my contact information is on nutritionfacts.org, and we can kind of work through the list. But in general, I mean, it'd be nice if there was a specific study showing a specific diet had specific benefits for that particular condition. Unfortunately, often we don't have that, but we can point to, but if you also don't want to die of a heart attack while you're dealing with these other things, here's some things we can do for you.
Should we supplement with zinc, or is that something to worry about?
I grew up in Texas where you just suck on a trailer hitch and then you get all the zinc you need. That's all.
One does not need to supplement with zinc. Legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils has all the things that we'd like to think of in animal source proteins, such as iron, zinc, but also, of course, having the bone, not only missing the bag, it's such saturated fat and cholesterol that comes along with animal sources of protein, but also has the bonus of all those vegetable kingdom things like folate and fiber, etc. So you kind of get the best of both worlds by choosing plant-based sources of protein. You get all. The problem is there's no real good test for zinc status. There's some nutrients in our body which you can get a sense with certain blood or urine tests. So that's why it's difficult to study. Often the first thing you sense in zinc deficiency is actually decreased taste sensitivity. I've kissed a few vegetarians I think taste pretty good to me, but one doesn't see a taste differential in terms of those eating plant-based versus omnivores, which would suggest there's really no difference in kind of zinc status. Fortunately, it's very difficult to test. And I'm presuming that you misheard. I mean, a pound of pumpkin seeds would be way more zinc than whatever anyone would need. Zinc deficiency has not been something that has popped up in long-term plant-based populations that we know of.
Great, thank you.
It won't be long before you have some major corporation that hires a porn star to say vegetarians taste better, so mark my words.
What is your advice? I do have a couple patients already that I know will benefit from major lifestyle change. What would be your advice for a first step to take as far as transitioning them to that way for someone who's not seeing you for that purpose?
My first step would be to ask them a question: why do you want to do this? And they'll generally say, I want to live longer. And then I'd say, why do you want to live longer? And they'd say, no one's ever asked me that before. I mean, there's especially living in San Francisco Bay Area where all the tech companies, there's a kind of an implicit assumption everybody wants to live forever. But I was suicidally depressed when I was in college, and a lot of people, I think that's the real epidemic in our culture, is with the breakdown of the social networks, is loneliness and depression. And telling someone who's lonely and depressed that they're going to live longer is not that motivating, because they're saying, I'm just trying to get through the day, and you say, why do you eat all these things? Why do you do all these things? And they'll say, they help me deal with my pain. They help me numb my pain. I've got 12 friends in this pack of cigarettes, or the food fills the void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, things I talked about earlier today, or video games numb the pain, or opioids numb the pain, or drinking all the time numbs the pain, or working all the time numbs the pain. And so I think it's really important that we deal with these kind of existential questions, because once then someone is say, well, I want to live longer. Well, gosh, I want to live longer, I don't know, to watch my kids grow up, or dance at their wedding, or whatever it is that, make love with my partner, write a book, accomplish something great in science, whatever it happens to be. If you can get someone in touch with their raison d'etre, why they want to live longer, then they're much more likely to do all the things. Most people have a pretty good idea of what they need to do to be healthy. They just don't do them because, as you say, Colin, the food addictions really are just to help them numb that pain that they're feeling. And so to the extent that you can help them get more in touch with their life's purpose and why they want to live longer, then they're much more likely to make these changes. Then you can say, okay, well, here's what you do. But until you deal with that, it's just a lot of information, and we're drowning in information. We need to really deal with the deeper issues that I think ultimately determine why people make sustainable changes.
In 1970 in the United States, there was about 50 billion spent on healthcare. In 2000, it was about $1.5 trillion, and this year we're hovering around the $3.5 trillion number. They say we have a healthcare problem in the United States. I don't think it's a healthcare problem. I think it's a health problem, and to address a health problem, we have to look at lifestyle, primarily diet, movement, so on and so forth. I'm not in the medical field. I'm just very interested in health and nutrition. And it seems like, Dr. Ornish, one of the quotes over the years from books that I've read from you that I really like is, there's an ounce of prevention or a pound of cure. And when 80% of the healthcare dollars are spent on 5% of the population due to what's mostly preventable diseases, it seems like the ounce of prevention is significantly less expensive than the pound of cure. We talked about it briefly this afternoon in some of the questions, but why aren't insurance companies all over lifestyle medicine as the ounce of prevention to prevent that pound of cure?
Well, I'd like to be able to take credit for the ounce of prevention and pound of cure, but actually that's been around for a long time. But in this context, it's true that 86% of the $3.6 trillion we spent last year in this country on healthcare, which is really mostly sick care, is for treating chronic diseases that are largely preventable and often even reversible through making these same lifestyle changes at a fraction of the costs, and the only side effects are good ones. And in this presidential debate, you know, it's like, are we going to have Medicare for all, or are we going to not? But there's this third alternative, again, which is to address the more fundamental causes of why people get sick, which to a large degree are the lifestyle choices we make. And think if we could free up a big chunk of that 86% of $3.6 trillion, we could make better care available for more people at much lower costs. And I think that part of the reason with insurance companies in the past has been this belief that they know that 30% of people change companies every year because they usually change their employers, and with that they change their insurance. And they say, okay, even if it does save money, it's going to take years to see the benefit, so why should we spend our money today for some future benefit that some other insurance company is going to get? And I say, well, that's because it's the right thing to do, and that was not the most convincing argument I could muster. And so we did these studies where we showed with, the first one was done in the early 90s with Mutual of Omaha, and we found that almost 80% of people who were told they needed to have a stent or a bypass, who were offered our lifestyle program as a direct alternative, were able to avoid surgery safely, and they saved almost $30,000 per patient in the first year, not years down the road. We did a study with Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield where they found that they cut their costs in half in the first year compared to a control group, you know, matched for age and gender disease severity, by half in the first year, and by 400% in the first year when they looked at the people that they'd spent at least $25,000 on or more in the previous year. 5% of people account for up to 80% of all healthcare costs. Those are the people who have chronic diseases. So the fact that we now show that we can actually reverse those, again, why I think reversal is an important term to use when it's appropriate, is that we can then save money in the first year. And then for a corporation, as you say, most large corporations are self-insured, so those savings accrue to their bottom line. If they have a key executive that has a bypass, they generally don't go back to work. They spend millions of dollars having to replace that key executive in addition to the costs themselves. And you know, we even found extreme cases, several people who could avoid a heart transplant by making these lifestyle changes. That saves over $1 million per patient, again, immediately. So now I think more and more insurance companies are beginning to look at these issues because they realize, as Michael said, is that it's good for their bottom line. And if it's good for the bottom line, then it's sustainable.
I think this question is more for Dr. Greger. My daughter's struggling with endometriosis, and she had a surgery, and she's at the age when where we would like some grandkids. They may not be coming because of it. She does not want to hear about plant-based nutrition. She says there's no scientific proof that will do anything with her problem, and obviously the doctor is against it as well. Well, he says that it's not going to do anything either way. Are there any proofs? Is there anything been researched?
So have you looked at nutritionfacts.org for endometriosis?
No, I honestly haven't.
Yeah, so, you know, it's funny. So there's now over 2,000 videos. And so it's funny, people will ask me, and I'll be like, have you checked out this great website that, if there's nothing on endometriosis on nutritionfacts.org, one of two things. Either there's no research, period, or there was no research at that point in time, and maybe there's something since. So I encourage everyone to use this wonderful resource called PubMed.gov. It's the database, the largest medical library in the world. And you can type in any disease and diet, and you can find out if there is something out there, either for the prevention or treatment. And if there is, please feel free to send it my way, and maybe I'll do a video about it. And so at least you can see if there's something out there. Sometimes there's just no studies at all. And so you can just, generally say, well, eating a healthy diet is helpful. But whether it helps particularly with that, I know there's certainly, I have a bunch of videos on fertility, improving both male and female fertility, and endometriosis is such a common cause of infertility. Maybe there's something in those videos, but you just have to check.
And the last, I want you guys to give you guys 30 seconds to tell us about your new books. So Dean, yours is out. Michael, yours is coming. You're working on one, so just 30 seconds and let us know what's coming. So Dean, go ahead.
My new book is called Undo It. My spiritual teacher, people say, what are you, a Hindu? He'd say, no, I'm an Undu, so it's in partial homage to that, as well as to the, obviously, the Nike ads. It's about how I took 40 years of work and reduced it down to its most basic understanding. Eat well, move more, stress less, love more. That's it. And the more diseases we study, the more mechanisms we look at, the more evidence we have. I present this new unifying theory that these are all the same diseases manifesting and masquerading in different forms. And my wife, Ann, has a how-to section of how you can actually reverse these conditions. I'm doing a lot of media this week for the book. I'll be on the Ellen DeGeneres show on Tuesday, and Fox and Friends on Monday, and Maria Bartiromo's show, and a bunch of other stuff, podcasts and so on. So if you're thinking of buying the book, this would be a good week to buy it, because we're hoping to get it onto the New York Times list this week.
Thank you, Dean. Michael?
My last book, How Not to Die, the next book out in December, How Not to Diet, on weight loss. It is essentially done. It's a big book. And
Short
they're trying
read, right?
What? Yeah, short read, 800 pages. Come on.
It's a fat book.
But it may actually be contracted since then. But we will lose none of the information. I'll make videos about everything. And so, but it may just not end up in the book. But it just goes through, first half of the book is 17 ingredients for an optimal weight loss diet. And so originally I was just going to go through all the existing diets. I'm on like the U.S. News and World Report panel. And, but every year there's new diets. And so like playing whack-a-mole. Instead of doing that, I said, well, let's just, what are the criteria for a healthy weight loss diet? And then you can compare those criteria to any new diet that comes down the pike. So that's the first half. And then the second half is ways that you can, regardless of what you eat, accelerate loss of body fat. And then I deal with chronobiology and microbiome and all sorts of other nifty ways. Any stubborn pounds that still need to come up. But core, spoiler alert, so diet centered around whole plant foods is not only the best diet for preventing, arresting, reversing many of our top killers, as I showed in the first book, but also the most effective diet ever shown of its kind in terms of weight loss. And so that was the broad study in New Zealand. And then talk about how there's specific foods that may be able to push that even further. Excited, it'll be out December 10th. And my first speaking engagement for my 200-city tour will be here in New York City. Hope to see you then.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Colin?
Over the years, I've become quite concerned about the fact that the science of nutrition itself is not very well respected. It's not really taught in medical systems and medical schools. There's a lot of confusion about nutrition. I just am overwhelmed by the kind of arguments that we end up with on details. And also at the same time, having been in this thing since the late 70s as far as policy development is concerned, I've had a good deal of experience and pushback, which in fact offered some lessons to me. And so I got very, very interested in why this vitriol at times, and not necessarily, I'm not talking about the plant-based community at all. I'm talking about just the people who are in the profession of nutritional science, the kind of things that have happened over the years. So I got quite concerned about that some years ago and went back and tried to understand better where did all this come from. And I got all the way back into the late 1700s, especially during the 1800s. Really learned some really fascinating things. Essentially discovering, I would argue, if I may, the roots of some of this problem, why there is so much confusion. There was a fascinating duality, in a sense, of two theories during the 1800s that one had to do with, in both cases they were speaking about cancer, one had to do with the fact that cancer is a local disease, therefore locally treated, and the best way to do it is cut it out. That was the simplistic version. The other was, that was called the local theory of disease. The other one had to do with the constitutional nature of disease, they called it. And that had a rich history, quite frankly, back to the 1700s. Had more to do with that, looking at this disease, not in its exquisite detail and single factors affecting things, but it really had to do with what, quite frankly, in the modern day we call nutrition in many ways. And so my book is about elaborating on that and then coming to the modern day to see how that history fed into the problems we have. I find it really fascinating. I'm quite excited about it. So I'm actually working on the last 5 paragraphs of the book. But I think it'll be out hopefully by the fall, maybe first of next year.
What's it going to be called?
I've got a couple of titles. I'll throw out one, just kind of, sense and feeling. Nutrition and Justice for All.
Nutrition and Justice for All. That's good. That's good.
So I have the ownership of that title now.
We're so grateful that you're here. Thank you.